All right, a warm welcome to all of you. We have a live audience with us in the room, and very warm welcome and thank you for attending. And then apparently, all over the world, we have another audience. This is the first time I've ever been involved directly in the webinar. So a warm welcome to all of those out there who we can't see, but we hope are enthusiastically forming a part of this important discussion today. My name is Steph Robenheimer. I'm a director at an NGO called South North, and I'm also involved in the Future Climate for Africa project, which is the program hosting this webinar today. So let me first say something very quickly before I introduce the people sitting with me about Future Climate for Africa, just to contextualize this webinar. It's a 5-year research program jointly funded by the UK's Department for International Development and the Natural Environment Research Council, NERC, both British organizations, of course. And its aim is to generate decision-relevant scientific research on climate change in the African context. I'll say a little bit more about it in a moment. The way the program is structured, there are 5 consortia of researchers and practitioners, and there is one knowledge coordination hub. Let me just say very briefly something about the consortia. There is a consortia called the African Monsoon Multidisciplinary Analysis 2050 program, which is looking at the West African monsoon system. It's called AMA 2050. There is a program called Integrating Hydroclimate Science into Policy Decisions for Climate Resilient Infrastructure and Livelihoods in East Africa, called High Crystal. I actually did that in one breath, almost. And that will look at East African impacts. There's a project called Uncertainty Reduction in Models for Understanding Development Applications, UMFULA, which is looking at the areas Central and Southern Africa, with specific reference to Tanzania and Malawi. There is a Pan-African project called Impala, looking at climate models covering the entire Africa. And then finally, last but not least, and host to this event today, is the Future Resilience for African Cities and Lands. The shorthand for that is FRACTAL. And FRACTAL is focused on cities rather than regions, and it is around that particular issue that we are coming together today. Now, this is a very large program. We are in the first year of the program, so there are many years to go yet. And it has essentially 2 ambitions. The one is to build bodies of research around the 5 to 40-year climate impacts in Africa. There is a great need for this research for this particular continent, and groundbreaking research will be done during the period of this program, which I hope will make an extraordinary difference to the way we understand climate in the African context. And secondly, this research, we hope, will develop an increased understanding by decision makers in various contexts in Africa with regard to their awareness of climate risks and vulnerabilities, and how they can integrate these risks into long-term development plans, policies, and investments. And we're going to hear a lot about that in the city's context. This is not easy. Connecting long-term climate understanding with short-term decisions that have long-term reach into the future, and most particularly decisions around infrastructure, is a complex area that needs this project. And I think it's on that basis that this first webinar on the project has attracted so much interest. So those are the two desired outputs of this program. It's tasked with demonstrating how improved information can be used to inform real development decisions. So they're going to be real on-the-ground programs, as well as in the laboratories and behind computers research. It's a combination of thought and people, and this is always very interesting. It raises the issue of a multidisciplinary approach, and today you will see sitting next to me are people not only from the climate science research world, but in fact people who have multiple disciplines. And I think this is what is particularly interesting and unique about this large program. The seminar that we're doing today represents critical discussion from a number of people on approaches for understanding the governance structures that shape medium-term development decisions taken in various African contexts and at various scales. In this case, the city, but the city within its region, within its catchment, within its national context. More specifically, the session aims to stimulate engagement and debate amongst all of you present and those online, to understand urban governance and decision-making pathways and find entry points for climate information to inform development decisions at a city regional scale. The aim is to sharpen the theoretical underpinnings and practical application of these programs within the Future Climate for Africa program. That's enough from me about the background. I have with me an extraordinary group of people, and you'll see why in a minute. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Starting first of all on my left, who will take the role of a discussant, and that means you can jump in and chirp whenever you need to.
Good.
Is Professor Sue Parnell. If you could introduce yourself, Sue.
Ooh.
Sorry, that's
so, thanks. Hello, everybody, and hello especially to those of you who are online. I work here in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town, and I'm an urban geographer, but I'm also very closely associated with something called the African Centre for Cities. So I'm not a climate scientist. I definitely come out of the urban stable rather than the climate stable. And I hope we'll be able to pick up, but I have worked on questions of climate change, including here in Cape Town, where for some years I chaired a thing called the Climate Think Tank, which tried to grapple with some of the questions that we're looking at here. But elsewhere in Africa, my expertise is definitely not on the climate question. So thanks.
All right, and then to my left again is Professor Diane Scott. Won't you just press the button?
Hi, I'm also from ACC and also an urban geographer. And so my interest is in urban governance and also in city environment issues. I've recently worked on a large comparative urban project, and some of the ideas I'll be presenting today will be drawn and be developed in the Fractal project from the previous work that I've done there. So I'm looking forward to the discussions.
And then Dr. Hannah Beleta from Pegasus Consulting.
Thanks, Steph. Yes, afternoon, everybody. My name is Hannah. I work for a consultancy called Pegasus, and we deal generally with water, climate, as well as transport challenges around South Africa as well as Africa. And then more broadly, basically, if you'll pay us, we'll work for you as consultants. So we get to do some pretty cool work. Our role in Fractal, or this FCFA project, was to support the consortia in developing a framework on how they can begin to ask these climate-related questions.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Good
Hannah.
afternoon.
And then Dr. Gilbert Siame. Please go ahead.
Thanks. He's called me doctor. I'm Mr. Not yet a doctor.
I'm happy to promote you for the moment.
Thank you so much. I'm Gilbert, and I teach at the University of Zambia in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. And I teach on a program called Master of Science in Spatial Planning. And my area of interest and research is quite broad, but Of relevance to this discussion is my interest in co-production of urban services, particularly for people in informal settlements. Thank you.
And finally, we have Dr. This time you are a doctor, aren't you?
Since 2005.
Excellent. Okay, I got it right this time. Dr. Tasila Banda, and you also from Zambia. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, as you heard, my name is Tasila Banda. I am the technical advisor and coordinator for the EC-LEDS program, which is funded by the USAID in Zambia, and I'm attached to the National Climate Change Secretariat. So I see my role in this discussion as someone that brings the policy level and coordination ideas that are going on climate change in the country, since the part of the focus today will be on Lusaka, Zambia.
Excellent. So the format we will adopt for this webinar seminar is that the speakers from Diane onwards will each speak for 15 minutes, and they have presentation material. In fact, Diane, you can take your place up at the podium. We will hold questions until they've spoken, and then Sue will react to their discussions, to their inputs rather, open the floor to discussion here with the participants who are physically present. In the meantime, the webinar participants will be able to, and I encourage them to do that as this webinar unfolds, to type in their questions and comments, and those will be gathered and passed up to me on an iPad, and between Sue and I we will facilitate those questions, and of course panelists may respond and we can have free discussion in the audience. We've got a time limit of 4 p.m., so without further ado, I invite the first input.
Thank you, Steph. I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about the Understanding Urban Governance, as the title suggests, entry points for climate science to inform development decisions. And I'm going to be presenting the theoretical ideas that are going to be applied in the Fractal project, which are still work in progress. And so this webinar gives me a great opportunity to get some of these ideas together in this presentation. As we've already heard, Fractal is one of 5 large international research projects which aims to explore the use of medium to long-term climate information to inform development decision-making in Africa. But what's interesting is that Fractal is the only project of the 5 that explicitly seeks these entry points in an urban context. And so the issues I'll be talking about will be understanding urban governance in particular. And so what Fractal aims to do then is to contribute to addressing the burning development issues in the sample of cities that we have chosen, and particularly those related to water and energy and the reduction of the disruption and damage from climate change. So we have a particular focus in the governance arrangements that we're interested in. In order to determine these appropriate and local level entry points, as they are termed, for climate information requires an understanding of urban governance arrangements in the sample of cities. And this urban research will take place in 3 what we call Tier 1 cities, and we call them city regions because we actually believe that cities are interdependent with their regions in terms of water, energy and climate change issues. So our Tier 1 city regions are Lusaka, Maputo and Windhoek, but there are Tier 2 cities, and Cape Town and Durban are the self-funded cities that are joining the project. So the question is then, I've put up a brief structure here for you of what I'll be talking about. And so the first point then is to briefly talk about urban governance in the Anthropocene. I believe it's important that research into urban governance in the Fractal project should be explicitly framed within the context of the Anthropocene. And as we know from the abundant literature, it's been broadly accepted that human impacts are greatly exacerbating and accelerating natural environmental change. In the literature, the Anthropocene is presented as an unpredictable and dangerous time for humanity, as humanity undermines the planetary life support systems. And this is now, as I said, accepted as a truism. The current literature casts the Anthropocene as a social rather than a natural problem, placing human agency at the center of attention. Another very important and widely recognized assumption about the Anthropocene in the transition and sustainability discourses is that the society-nature binary can no longer apply because natural systems have been so altered that they can no longer be thought of as natural, but rather as socio-natural systems. So these are important assumptions that we need to bear in mind as we go forward in our understanding of urban governance in these regions. Over the last decade, cities worldwide have been responding experimentally in different ways to the simultaneous social, political, and environmental threats facing them at this time. Academics too are responding as the Anthropocene ushers in the issue of responsibility and the need to do something to contribute to resilient and sustainable urban transformations. And Fractal and the larger FCFA program is one of these responses. Another contribution to understanding urban governance in Africa is from the field of urban studies. The growing body of literature on the southern urbanism highlights the importance of understanding the historical, social, cultural, and economic differences between the cities of the north and the cities of the global south, and the need to integrate and mainstream climate change responses within current development needs and not to treat them as a separate agenda. The new urban SDGs, termed the New Urban Agenda, to be debated at Habitat 3, proposes cities as the nexus for the achievement of all the other SDGs. So this is quite an important issue globally. Throughout the urban governance literature is the pervasive imagining of cities as integrated socio-ecological networks, intimately connected to global networks in which cities are seen as both agents of change and also vulnerable subjects of global processes. And these roles playing out differently in different places. The problem is that we're faced with, and that the project has to wrestle with, is how to understand how do we govern this totality. So we ask the question then, what is urban governance? There are many theories and definitions of urban governance from various disciplines. Urban governance can be understood as the multiple ways through which city governments, business, residents, civil society organizations interact in managing urban space and life, nested within a broader context of other levels of government and other non-state actors who are also managing their spaces in these cities. Castanbroto alternatively refers to governance as the multiple ways through which diverse actors intervene in controlling and managing the city. Essentially, then, what these two definitions suggest is that urban governance is about controlling and managing. And I would add here that urban governance is also about transforming the city. In the Fractal project, it is specifically the governance of water, energy, and climate change in relation to development that is of interest to us. Each city, in its own unique context, with a different set of influential actors and issues, will display a different institutional and decision-making landscape. And we are expecting and proposing that that's what we'll find when we look at our 3 Tier 1 cities. The concept used to understand governance in the Fractal project is the notion of what is called urban governance configurations. And this idea and this concept was originally developed and applied in a project that I mentioned earlier that I worked in called the Chance to Sustain project. And here we developed this concept, and this research in the Fractal project will be a further development of these ideas. Okay, so let's have a look. What then is an urban governance configuration? So we might think of it as an ensemble or set of actors, their discourses, their knowledge that they hold, the institutions, the policies and practices, the platforms through which they engage, and the technologies that they develop. And when these come together to govern urban life in different ways, spatially and temporally. So the idea is that you've got this set of elements that together create a particular configuration of institutional arrangements. And if we're trying to understand how to insert climate information, we need to understand this particular configuration in these cities at this current time. The theory draws from both assemblage theory and political economy. And it's clear from the literature that understanding configurations, governance configurations, is a very complex thing. But it can produce detailed understandings of how these different sets of elements come together and become assembled to create a particular institutional landscape. The decision-making pathways of actors can be traced, and the outcomes, the development outcomes, understood by exploring the dynamics of these governance configurations in different domains. Now, the domain we're interested in, as I said, is water governance, in our case, energy, and in relation to climate change. And so the argument is that if we have an understanding of governance arrangements, we'll be better equipped to imagine future alternatives. And that's the critical point here, is that if one understands what it is in the governance arrangements that is creating particular blockages, that we'll be able to imagine what alternatives might be. And from some earlier engagements with the cities, we've already seen city officials talking about the need for changes in government arrangements and institutional arrangements. So this is what we intend to study in detail. Although governance configurations are assembled in provisional and contingent ways, we have to think of them as being purposeful, as they do fulfill a dominant strategic function, and that is to manage and address crises in the urban context as they arise. So I'm just going to run quickly through the set of analytical elements. You can see the point up on the slide. There are a set of analytical elements that we are going to look at in order to understand these institutional arrangements. First of all, there's the diversity of actors in each city, the networks of actors, coalitions that are involved in governance. And these are assumed to be multi-sectoral across the municipalities and government departments. They're multi-scalar. They are not only, can be international, national, etc., and can include non-state actors. Of a significant importance are different forms of power, of engagement and power relations between them. And now that's the important thing, is to understand how these different actors engage with each other and where the power lies. The shift from government to governance has led to increased influence of non-state actors, and in the cities that we see, and I'm sure Gilbert will talk about this when he speaks. We have a lot of, for example, business, civil society organization, NGOs, donors, social movements, which are influencing the governance arrangements and exerting influence for particular decisions. Therefore, decision-making power becomes more dispersed, and there are a range of knowledge claims amongst these different stakeholders. And so the negotiation of the development outcomes is often accompanied by tension and conflict. And it's very clear then that the political character of urban decision-making is critical to understand these decision pathways. A further important element of governance configuration is the discourses or language used by the actors as they argue their point and pursue their interests and try and persuade other actors to make certain decisions. For example, Sutherland et al. Identify a number of water discourses prevalent in decision-making processes and policies in Durban, such as water as an economic good, water as a social good, and more latterly, the emergence of the discourse of water as a scarce resource. So these discourses are driving the kinds of decisions and priorities of different decision makers. The policies and institutional mandates of actors are also very important, providing the rules and the norms for decision making. The platforms and processes through which these actors engage and deliberate with each other inside and outside of the state. And finally, the governance configuration, interestingly, also considers the materialities of urban life, the technologies, the infrastructure, the physical attributes of the city and the city region. And so one has to understand this idea of a governance configuration. It attempts to capture these specific dimensions which in relation produce particular development outcomes and decisions. I think that's the important thing. So at any particular time, it's the particular actors, which are the dominant discourses, which are the platforms, where is the power lying as to what kinds of decisions get made. And it's this terrain that we need to understand if we are to think about inserting climate information for improved decision making. So in conclusion, we can ask what power and use does this approach offer? First of all, it's argued here that the application of this concept has the potential to identify sticking points and also moments of opportunity in the decision-making pathways for the provision of relevant and appropriate climate information. And this would in turn lead to more context-relevant climate and development decision-making. So it's this fine detail of the institutional arrangements that will provide insight into where opportunities arise and where there are problems, and what alternative arrangements might be more beneficial. The governance configuration will also demonstrate that Southern African cities are not generic decision-making spaces, but they display very different urban processes and realities than do cities elsewhere, based on the southern experiences of urbanization and urban living. And I think quite an interesting concept is that the governance configuration provides a frame for exploring the city region as what Latour calls a critical zone in the Anthropocene. And according to Latour, this critical zone can be any spot on the Earth's surface, on the envelope of the Earth's biosphere, which extends from the atmosphere to the sterile geology below and extends out horizontally across the landscape. So a critical zone is a point on the Earth's surface. And what he means by this is that these zones at this time, and the Lusaka city region being one of them, is conceived to be an area under stress, requiring a diverse array of scientists to understand, measure, and monitor what's going on in this critical space in order to influence policy making and shift cities onto climate-resilient pathways of development. So with that understanding, and I hope you did get some understanding of what a governance configuration is and what institutional landscapes are, I'd like to have a look at a set of, I'm going to come to them now, but what we've been doing in Fractal is in one of our clusters called the Nexus cluster. A group of us, an interdisciplinary group of members of the Fractal team, have been getting together and trying to get an understanding of a common language that we can use to understand these city regions and to create a conceptual model of the spatial configuration of people, institutions, water flows, climate change, hydraulic and energy technologies, governing water and energy in the face of climate change. So this is what we're trying to do, and it's very much work in progress. But I think what's interesting is just to show you some of the very, very early work that we've been doing. And if you look at the diagram that's up on the screen, this, you can see by the title, the language has not yet quite been worked out. We're still working on trying to understand each other in a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary way. But you can see there a diagram showing a set of elements. In other words, you could think of it as a governance configuration, which includes the physical and the physical characteristics of the region. It includes flows of water, it includes the rivers, and on the left-hand side is depicted the Kafue catchment, the Kafue River catchment, and on the right-hand side is depicted the city of Lusaka. And so what this diagram maps out then is almost like a topological space where you've got a whole lot of elements that are connected. And in blue are all the elements associated with water. They include the flows of water, they include the technologies, for example, the dams, and there are pipes through which, and channels and canals through which water flows. So all of these elements are part of this conceptual model that we're trying to develop. The yellow, as you can see there, they are depicted as the different institutions and actors, from the Zambian government down to local community farmers in the Kafue Valley. The dark blue at the top is the power generation, which is critical, coming from the Itezi and the Kafue Gorge Dam, providing hydroelectric power for the city of Lusaka. And then the pink are climate-related issues which are linked in. So this is a very, almost like a sketch to start off with, where we've tried to put together the different elements that make up the city region, to combine the socio-economic political elements of governance with the physical characteristics of the physical systems in the region. I just want to show you, for example, if one were to unpack this into a network of networks, one of the networks that we would look at, which has just been very briefly developed here, is this one of looking at the national actors, and thanks to Jan Hoeland, who helped sort out these maps for me, but I don't know why he put the actors in yellow puffy clouds, but it's interesting to see the range of different actors that are involved in decision making. And here you have a depiction of the local government institutions focusing on the Lusaka City Council, and at the bottom included there is one of the key policy documents, which I'm sure Gilbert will talk about, which is the Urban Development Plan for 2030. And so on it goes. These are non-state actors, infrastructure, and the hydrological system, which the team has jointly been working on to try and begin to look at the different elements and how they are related to and connected to each other. So I'd like to leave you with that, and I look forward to your comments and questions later. Thank you.
Guy, thank you for that opening keynote address. I think this outlines the issue of the cities as systems and the actors and the interplay between those, and of course the looming climate question. We are indeed in the Anthropocene, and I think that puts it very bluntly that cities will have to address this issue. It's a question of how. All right, we move on to Hannah.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, I work for a consultancy called Pegasus, and we were asked by the FCFA, the Future Climate for Africa project, to support them in providing a framework for the 8 different consortia that Steph mentioned earlier. 5. Just shows how well I listened. 5 different consortia in supporting them in unraveling the really complex maps that Di showed us earlier, that this is a real system, and actually how are we going to intervene in this real living system of the cities that are managed by these socio-governance arrangements as well as the natural resources that are flowing through them. So the FCFA in general are focusing on long-lived investments with sunk capital costs, long-term planning and policy making, and then thirdly, interventions with long-term lead times. And so our core questions to support the consortia were, what are the long-lived economic decisions that are most relevant? Which institutions and processes exert the greatest influence? Let's, cut the wood from the trees, however the saying goes. And what is the most appropriate strategy for influencing these institutions? So essentially, we're trying to look at the political economy of how climate change, or how decisions are made, and how climate change can be inserted into these decisions. And so our approach to investigating this was first to define all the different types of adaptation-relevant, long-lived economic decisions. What are they, where are they, and who is involved in making those decisions? We then developed a framework, which I'll talk about in a minute or so, for analyzing who makes these decisions and where they are placed within the very complicated governance structures that we have set up as human beings. And then thirdly, to analyze our framework against a number of different case studies to see if it really has any meat and if it really is useful, and to try and refine that so that it's something that the research consortia actually need as opposed to some cool pictures. So what we started with in the beginning, initially, was to see 5 different types of economic decisions that are relevant. The first is infrastructure, and the second is natural resources infrastructure. And these together are in a bucket of natural environment-related decisions. Infrastructure fundamentally changes the natural environment that we are living upon. The second 2 was economic structure and strategy, and social policy and systems. And this is more the socio-economic bucket of where decisions are made. So we may decide as a city that actually what we want first and foremost is to become the best flower exporter in the world beyond all other decisions. And that's an economic decision that you then make. And that has certain ramifications in terms of your economic policy, etc., etc. So we wanted to sort of bucket the economic and social type decisions that can be made. And then finally, there's the institutional flexibility. So these are the institutions that we have that inform our economic policy, that inform our social policy, that then change the nature of how our natural resources are developed or managed, etc. And so, although this was really useful in the beginning, where the rubber really hits the road and what we were really interested in is the natural resources system, the infrastructure, and how we ensure that infrastructure decisions that are made now have teeth going forward when climate is different. So that's where the framework began, but it was in general more focused around that, although it still stands for the other buckets of economic decisions. And an important recognition to make is that there's not only a spatial, a scalar consideration to make, so from national government down to subnational level governance structures, down to city level governance structures, down to even transboundary level structures, but there's also a temporal scale. So a dam that is built next year actually had maybe a 10, 15-year pipeline before that, where decisions were being made that led up to the dam that's built next year. And so where is actually that key point that we need to intervene with climate relevant information to ensure that that dam is climate smart, as opposed to a dam that doesn't serve us well in the next, what was our time frame, 5 to 40 years. So it starts off with policy, and we take certain policy directions as a government towards where we want to lead. And then there comes a planning element with that. And then finally the implementation, and then reform. And it's actually should be a circle, because as we reform, we reinsert this information into our policy and our planning and our implementation. And what's really important to note with this is that that policy box and that planning box has different people, and there are actual people involved at all those different levels. And they're each making decisions that may or may not align with the people above them or the people below them. And so if we really do want to, in a very tangible way, get climate information in there, we need to be cognizant of these different levels and just try and simplify it so that we're hitting the mark. So we had a set of key research questions just to inform our analysis, and it's similar to the three I'd flagged earlier. So what are these decisions and which are most relevant? Which institutions have the greatest influence? How do the decision makers use scientific evidence, if any? And what is the most appropriate strategy for influencing? Just to try and focus where we actually need the consortia to zone in on. And what we then developed was, I had never really realized quite how useful 4 simple little circles were going to be. But and when you look at it initially, it's quite a random grouping of things. So the one bubble is water and energy systems. The other bubble is agriculture and land. The third bubble is flooding. And the fourth bubble, urban planning. And if you think about how decisions are made in government around each of these 4 bubbles, they're actually fundamentally quite different. And so although you'd initially say, oh, water and energy, that shouldn't be in the same bubble, it's all about infrastructure and these massive decision-making processes. If it is on a national scale about national government saying we're going to invest in a massive dam, or it's about small sort of independent providers of water or energy at a more local scale. And so the decision making, the political economy around these 4 bubbles is quite distinct. So for flooding, for example, it's all about cooperation and sharing information so that we have access to relevant information if there's a disaster such as flooding. And then agriculture and land also has quite a distinct decision making process from a ministerial perspective, or from an investment perspective too. So in that case, it's more about the private sector investors moving into areas, recognizing opportunities and driving that agenda, as opposed to a lot more public sector driven agenda from a water and energy perspective. Okay, perfect. So we did this for a number of case studies, as I'd mentioned: Rufiji, Maputo, Lusaka, Lake Victoria, Burkina Faso, and then also Senegal. And just to ensure my presentation had pictures, there they are on a map. But I'll just quickly zone in onto the Lusaka case study, and I know Gilbert will be speaking more about it later. But what's interesting about Lusaka, and show of hands, who has ever been to Lusaka? Okay, so Sam, Lusaka is a fascinating city. We have 2 people from Zambia with us. But the city itself is interesting from a resource and a climate risk perspective. But more importantly, the city receives a large amount of its water and its energy, as Di mentioned earlier, from further afield. And so from a climate perspective, we mustn't just focus on the city and the city alone, but where the city is getting its food and its water and its energy from. And it's actually in that further afield region that we also need to insert climate relevant information. And so just to inform this case study and the research, we developed a big institutional map of who is all involved, and then developed sort of a time frame. So along the top you can see the policy, planning, implementation and reform framework of how decisions are made over time, and then just trying to communicate how those decisions happen at different levels. So it may start with a donor or development finance. It may move down to the Ministry of Water. The decision may then move across to the refugee or the river basin office, move down into a more local level, and that's sort of how the map is developed. So this was just quite an interesting way of using this framework to try and simplify the governance complexity into saying where do we really need this information to go and who should be reading it. I think that will be all from me for now, although obviously I can go on forever, so please ask me questions. Is it still in order?
Thank you, Hannah. That sort of begins to focus us inward toward Lusaka. And I think also reminds us that there are extraordinarily large development deficits in Africa. And Lusaka is not alone in its own level of development deficits. I see here in the documents extraordinary statistics in that regard. And I'll just lift one, which is that people living in informal housing 94% of them don't have lease agreements. Now that sounds like a silly little thing. But imagine that the large part of the population is living without any form of tenure whatsoever. It's probably sitting outside the tax system, outside the rate system, outside any formal system. And imagine and compare that to a city like Brussels for a moment. And that gives you a picture of the difference between a Lusaka and a fully organized, if not developed city like Brussels. So, for someone from Lusaka, over to you, Gilbert.
Thank you so much. Like I was introduced at first, I'm Gilbert, who is teaching at the University of Zambia, and also I've been quite involved in working with the state government and also national government on helping the government address some of the critical issues that border on service delivery, particularly planning-related stuff. And the question and the concern that about 95% of the people in informal settlements don't have any sort of tenure. Yes, that is true, and that presents a huge governance and planning service delivery issue. In terms of what I'm going to talk about, I did 3 circles just to try to contextualize what the 2 first speakers did. And the guiding arguments, key guiding arguments, is that in the seat, in terms of governance, Lusaka is not, or the whole country has not implemented the decentralization policy fully. And so what you get is increased influence of the central government and quasi-government institutions. The second one is the issues that we are focusing on, particularly water and energy, actually do not fall within the mandate of local government. They have a huge influence, but in terms of who makes a decision and who makes investment, that is outside the mandate of local governments. And so in terms of who really makes a decision regarding water security and water resilience, water investments, water decisions, the first important institution is a private company, which is Lusaka Water and Storage Company, that is run pure on as a business, but the city council has shares. And what you get in the first, the key decision circle, the one I've labeled key decision makers. The second one, which is the LWSC, that's Lusaka Water and Storage Company, has the mandate to deliver water to all the residents in the city of Lusaka. But this institution faces or operates within an institutional framework, and the first one being Lusaka City Council, which has the mandate to govern the city and also to coordinate service delivery. And what you get there is that any activity that Lusaka City Council is implementing, they have to collaborate with, 1, the shareholder, 2, the mandate holder to govern the city. And you find the Lusaka City Council having quite a strong influence on what happens, especially on the delivery side of things. And also when you talk of the huge part of the city, which is informal, which is unplanned, but very much, sometimes very much close to the inner part of the city or the CBD, the city has to give some kind of clearance in order to get services in those areas. In terms of tenure, that is still the city that is supposed to ensure that tenure papers are given to the people occupying space that is not planned. So you have the city council as 1, a regulator and also a service provider. And then you have ZEMA, which is Zambia Environmental Management Agency, and this is an important player, because for the water that is coming to Lusaka, 50%, not 50%, but 44% of the water is coming from the Kafue, which Hannah talked about, and then about 56% of that of the water that is pumped into people's houses and businesses is coming from groundwater. And the institution that is mandated to ensure that the groundwater reserve and recharge areas or resources are protected is Lusaka City Council through its mandate to do the planning. Then ZEMA is supposed to ensure that the water that is being extracted from Kafue and also the water that is coming from the ground is being done within the environmental requirements of the nation. So have a direct impact of what ZEMA is doing into the Lusaka Water and Storage Company, which is a private entity responsible from water extraction, treatment, pumping, and wastewater management. And then they're being regulated by ZEMA. Then we have a new institution, which is WAMA, called Lusaka Water Resources and Resources and Management Agency. Water Resources Management Agency, sorry, which is the new entity basically coming in to give the mandate or to guarantee or to give water rights to institutions that are going to be extracting water, and particularly to ensure that catchment areas are well managed. So you have two regulators, ZEMA and WAMA, direct having an impact on what decisions are made in terms of Lusaka Water and Storage Company. Then you have a very key player here, particularly for Lusaka, the donor agencies, and we have big funding coming into the city, which has, I think, institutions like GIZ that have been in the water sector for a long time, and they have huge budgets supporting Lusaka Water and Storage Company on technologies, on treatment, and also sometimes on human resource. So they begin to have a huge impact on what exactly Lusaka Water does. And then also you have Millennium Challenge Corporation pumping in for the period of 3 years about $355 million to connect or to improve the water pumping system and infrastructure from Kafue to Lusaka. And those are decisions that are being made which will last for a long time. Basically, they will shape what Lusaka, the water situation in Lusaka will be in the next years. Then other players like Ministry of Local Government and Housing, they are key players because the centralization framework is, the governance framework is that you have the local government which do not have the local government system without full mandates to make particular decisions or key decisions, especially those with political implications. And so what you get is when Lusaka City Council cannot make particular decisions, the ministry comes in and they make those decisions, or they have to consult. And that becomes very important. And also funding comes to the city, comes through the ministry. The Department of Water is a critical player, Department of Water Affairs, which is now being transformed into Department of Water Development. Their mandate will basically be to work with water development of water companies, particularly like Lusaka Water and several other companies that are interested, that are investing or doing business in the water industry. Basically to plan and provide funding and regulation into the water industry. But in terms of strategic significance, that may not really be on top, because you have a water company that is operating as a business and being supported hugely by other external players. Then I'll quickly run through the second circle, which is basically ZESCO. ZESCO has, which is a company responsible for power, that's for energy, operating as a quasi-government institution under the Ministry of Energy. They have direct implications on the water for two key reasons. One, they determine the operations at Lusaka Water because of the energy to extract, treat, and pump the water. And now what you get today, like now, there is no safe space in the city because the whole country has energy deficit, and in the end, even critical installations are suffering. So the water company responsible for that is having a huge challenge in terms of connecting the water. The water may be there, but there is no energy to pump it, and that's something that is actually affecting what is happening in the city. Second is NWASCO, which is basically a regulator to ensure services are provided to the people, and the key proportion of the residents in the city in informal settlements, you find NWASCO and non-government organizations taking up that challenge and doing the investments. Then surrounding districts, you have Kafue. Thanks. You have Kafue, and basically what you get there is it's a surrounding district and hosting or having the control on the Kafue in terms of planning, in terms of who does agriculture and so on. So you have a huge set of actors, but these three key and primary actors are influenced by the other bigger circles, like the Ministry of Finance, because that's where the money is coming from. And then you have SADC, because the water in the Zambezi River is a shared resource through the Zambezi River Authority, determining how much water actually goes to ZESCO in order to get the power, and also the SADC power agreements, determining how much actually power goes into ZESCO, and ZESCO how much power can come to Lusaka. So that's kind of a dynamic, very confusing, but basically that's the kind of scenario that we have. And then in terms of the Kafue, I'll quickly run through. An important part of the city to determine water security, and much investment is actually going to that region. You have the Kafue there, but the key sectors, like I mentioned, you have Zema, Lusaka, and Wama, as well as ZESCO, as key direct players. Zema providing the regulation in terms of environment, Wama providing the regulation in terms of water rights, Lusaka Water directly doing the investment in terms of infrastructure infrastructure across the water value chain. And then you have other actors like the donor out there, the donors, basically influencing what Lusaka Water and Storage Company is doing, because major of the funding is actually coming from outside, like I mentioned. So that by the end of the day, what happens in the Lusaka, in the Kafue flats, which is a critical resource in terms of water for Lusaka, as I said, that's 40% plus. Then also ZESCO giving us about 900 megawatts. If those key players around are not engaged with the climate information and climate data, particular information for them to make the correct decisions, then the water resilience for Lusaka could hugely be compromised. Then in terms of my last slide on economic decisions, the major ones, the Minister of Finance, and my friend from Zambia will talk about their role, but key in that is that they influence what happens in the city, because there is a program to mainstream climate in all decision-making processes across the ministries, and potentially to the local authorities where necessary. And there's Zambia National Climate Change Secretariat. My friend will talk about that because she's from there. Then Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry, and Zambia Development Agency. What is shaping the city and what will shape the city in a few years from now is we may end up getting the whole city shifting the CBD into a totally new space, which will sit on the groundwater research area. And what is happening there, the Ministry of Commerce is pushing investment, private sector investment, by just doing the infrastructure and creating clusters or economic zones. And there's huge opportunity to influence what private sector could do through making Ministry of Commerce a little bit more climate smart, so that there are regulations in terms of development, in terms of infrastructure, and also buildings could begin to respond to what is happening in the next few years. The Lusaka City Council has the mandate to govern the city, and they do all these functions you see in the middle of the table, from solid waste management, which is a huge issue for the city, and is investment that is being discussed in terms of getting the solid waste out of the streets and protect groundwater recharge areas. Then you have spatial planning, you have infrastructure, particularly ecological green spaces and the streams, so that you reduce on the flooding. Those are the mandates. But the challenge is that in most cases, what we see in the city is that these Lusaka city is run on by politicians, the councillors, and that leads to decisions that are looking maybe basically 5 years or less, because they have the mandate of 5 years, and that creates a very difficult dynamic in terms of looking beyond 5 years and going forward, and that's a huge challenge there. But it's an important entry point. Then the next one is there is potential through spatial planning for the city council to actually coordinate what is happening, and in their planning and design or regulation mechanisms to be a little bit more climate smart. But they have huge challenges in terms of human resource and in terms of interference also from the top. Then my last points basically have RDA, and I will just talk about DESCO, like I talked about, which is energy. Lusaka is supplied or receives energy from basically two sources. We have the Kafue flats, which is the gorge, and that's about, for the whole country, that's about 900 megawatts, and also the Zambezi River through the Kariba. And the challenge that we have in terms of also getting the climate entry points or climate information to influence them make decisions. Sometimes that goes beyond their mandate. Like we have the Zambezi River. They had to be regulated, like in the last year. They had to be regulated to, in terms of how much water they could get, because Zambezi is shared, and the Zambezi River Authority had to say this is how much water they could get, and that becomes an important issue. It's a transboundary resource, and their mandate to regulate and is to invest and regulate, to tap the resource. Sometimes it's beyond them, and that's an important thing that should be considered. Then there are regional power agreements. What happens in the seat sometimes goes beyond, because there are commitments that power has to be sold sometimes to neighboring countries, particularly Zimbabwe, and also there are agreements with Namibia, and so on and so forth. So that is an issue that Lusaka City Council will have nothing, and Lusaka Water also have to struggle. There's room, however, to promote some kind of collaboration, and that's something I think we can discuss later on. So in terms of, by the end of the day, what you see, the decisions, several players, several stakeholders, by the end of the day, what you get is a city that has, especially in the yellow, I don't know if you are able to see, but the yellow is the built up or residential spaces, and that constitutes about 40% informal and about 60% to 65% informal. And in terms of who invests in those informal spaces and who supplies water and energy, that's a very difficult question to deal with, because in the first place, they're not supposed to receive the service by law. But they are there, and they are the majority. So that's an issue. Then you have the Ministry of Commerce doing the multi-facility economic zones, investing in very important ecological spaces, particularly for groundwater recharge, through the Lusaka South multi-facility economic zone, huge space. And that begins to compromise the supply of the water, because that begins to sit on the 50% of the water that's supposed to be supplied. So by the end of the day, the decisions seem, the way the institutions are a bit incoherent. You see that getting down to decisions that are also incoherent. And by the end of the day, you get a city that is growing quite fast, but without considering what will happen in the near future. And much of the important resources, particularly for groundwater, is being affected. And you have the private sector investing and building gated communities very far, and they are relying on boreholes. And that will affect what the city will be tomorrow. Even in terms of resilience, that is a big issue, because you have spaces like in Kwashi, very big multi-million development, and another space by the Chinese developing a complete gated community outside the built-up space, and they are not connected, but they have been allowed by local authorities and several stakeholders to go ahead. And what will happen is a challenge in terms of who's going to supply the water there and what type of infrastructure will that be. I think I'll end here. Sorry. Yeah, thanks.
Without further ado, Tisela, we have to race against the clock a little bit now, I'm afraid. Okay. But I'm not cutting you short. So.
All right. Can I? All right. Good afternoon. As already introduced, I am working with the Interim Interministerial Climate Change Secretariat. So this topic today fits right within the mandate of the Climate Change Secretariat. And although we have not actively been involved in the urban area climate resilience work, it still falls within the mandate of the Secretariat. So what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon is just to just walk you through the work that Zambia is doing in terms of encouraging climate change resilience, and also to encourage you to walk with me through these slides and try to see for yourselves, those of you who are within the room and those watching through the streaming, so that we can help guide the Lusaka project into some of the entry points based on the high-level activities that are already taking place within the country in terms of climate change. That way we can have a good discussion and guide the researchers into the right direction for future research that would help the city to become more resilient. So as already indicated by the Lusaka specific presenters, it's clear that Lusaka doesn't sit as an island within the country. It's dependent on the catchment area. It's dependent on the other provinces around it. And to be honest, for Zambia, it's dependent on the rest of the country, really, because we are getting connections that are growing bigger and bigger as you move away from the city. So what is the work that is going on in Zambia in terms of climate change? It's clear, I mean, for this program to start, there is a common understanding that climate change is posing a major development challenge for the country. There are numbers there, and I don't believe that given the time I need to walk through them, but there are losses in terms of GDP and growth. There is increased vulnerability for communities, whether in Lusaka or in rural areas, as a result of climate change. The trends are clearly there. For if you look at the projections historically from 1960 to the present, there will be increased temperatures, increased rainfall and flooding in some places, as well as droughts. This year, for example, is an example of a year that is drier, and we are already faced with crisis in the water sector as well as in the energy sector that has already been presented by area presenters. So there is the trend in terms of temperature and rainfall that I already spoke about. And just to show you on the map, Lusaka, I wish I could point, but is very close to the sub-basin that is in red, which are the areas that will be affected mostly with the food needs. Also with the floods, but I can't point to it now. I can share this later. So this is just a map showing where the exposure would be in terms of climate vulnerability. The most vulnerable households are those that are led by single women or single men after the death of a spouse, the elderly and the disabled people. Unfortunately, many traditional coping mechanisms that were in a way playing as indigenous way of early warning systems are no longer working due to the unpredictability and changing economic conditions. So what is the response to this at the national level? We started out with the National Adaptation Program Action, which identified major vulnerable sectors, which included agriculture for the sake of food security, wildlife and forest, human health, water and energy. That led us to the draft National Climate Change Response Strategy. In that strategy, there was identification of the much needed policy to be drafted in order to help us respond to climate change. This is actually what led to the setting up of the interim interministerial climate change secretariat where I am working. Beyond that, of course, we have been developing different types of NAMAs, which are on the mitigation side. And much more recently, Zambia has developed its nationally determined contributions, which were submitted to the UNFCCC, which contained both mitigation and largely adaptation actions. So as a country, we are looking into how do we build the resilience. And this all comes within the Vision 2030 that was already mentioned earlier, which is to become a prosperous middle-income country by 2030. And within that comes the national programmatic strategy, which is to be a climate-resilient economy. And then beyond that, just below, the national program goal is climate change mainstreamed in most economically important, vulnerable sectors of the economy by 2015, which was last year. So we have just ended the 6th National Development Plan in 2015, and we are currently working on the 7th National Development Plan. And in terms of decision making and governance, of course, you can see that we are planning on short-term 5-year processes, which are much short-term than what this program is looking out for, which is 30 to 40 years. So I think this is not uncommon. I think most countries in Africa are also planning on that interval. But we hope to accomplish this through different themes, adaptation and disaster risk reduction, where a program like this would fall under, is one of them. And under that, of course, there's participatory adaptation and climate resilience, resilient infrastructure. There are some programs that have been started already at this point in Zambia, which I hope I will have time to share with you. But you should be able to find this on our website that I can provide as well. But all these things, then the mitigation, there is also research and development, which speaks very well to this research work that's going on here. Policy and development, mainstreaming and negotiations. Of course, the most important, finance, identification and resource mobilization. Because as a country, of course, we have put a lot of good policies in place and strategies in place. And one of the clearly and well understood problems is taking those policies into action. So resource mobilization was also identified as being important. This is our institutional arrangement. On the top there in yellow is where the Climate Change Secretariat falls. Sorry that the name is different, but it is where it sits with all the different working groups as proposed, and all the line ministries on the bottom. So local government would also sit under the bottom. So think of the Secretariat as the body that coordinates all the climate change work, and then the line ministries implementing the work. I seem to be going backwards. And this is just to show the functions of the Secretariat, which I have already shared with you, and just to show some of the examples of the things that are going on. It's relatively new from 2013, but there is a growing portfolio of things. There is the pilot program for climate resilience, which is, I think, what helped us to be invited to this discussion today. I'll show you where that program is going on. The scaling up of renewable energy program, the SREP, the RED Plus work. The country has gone through the process of developing its strategy for reduced deforestation and forest degradation. We are just next week, for example, will be in a province where we are going to start implementing this work. The government of Zambia, together with the UN agencies within the country, also have a joint program on climate change. We do have green growth strategy work going on. My work that I'm attached to the Secretariat is enhancing capacity on low emission development strategies. There is Green Climate Fund work. Our national coordinator, Mr. David Kalua, who some of you might know, has been sitting on the GCF board up until very recently. And I don't know if you are also aware that this last year, Zambia was the first least developed country to host the board of the GCF. He's currently sitting on the Adaptation Fund of the UNFCCC. There is also very recently an addition of resilience and cohesion of displaced persons and border communities. These are refugees that have moved into the country, have been living there, and now we are taking deliberate action to have them resettled in areas where they can economically become productive, provide the social services that they need in connection and within the same communities as the local Zambian communities. In terms of the PPCR, There is climate resilience infrastructure investment, participatory adaptation, and the strategic support. This is self-explanatory, but I'll just show you on the next map where these two activities are taking place. The Kafue Basin, which the earlier presenters, you have heard them mention, the Kafue Basin, which is supplying water and energy to Lusaka, is one of the areas where we are working, we are implementing a program under the African Development Bank. The other next to it on the west is the Barose sub-basin. So there we are focusing on resilience in infrastructure, but also improvement of livelihoods. In the Kafue, there is also all the way to infrastructure in terms of the climate resilient road networks within the Kafue Basin. While in the Barose, it's also climate resilience canal rehabilitation. These are areas that have been flooded and people are losing arable land where they can grow crops. But now with the rehabilitation of the canals, they are able to get the water, get connected to other communities during the flooding seasons, and some of the land is reclaimed back and they can use it. We have examples of gardens growing on areas that would otherwise be flooded. Okay. So that's on energy. When you talk about Lusaka and energy, there's already a program going at the Secretariat with the Department of Energy. The forestry, I hope that at some point with research going on that we can think about reducing the island effect of Lusaka with urban forestry, for example. So programs are already in place at a high level that would support that. No need to talk about that and that and that. I think that some of the entry points that I saw going through the reports is the recognition that the planning happens at very short intervals. We can all accept that. We have seen it in the reports. And we, as a secretariat, through the PPCR and in collaboration with the DMMU and the Met Department, there are things happening in terms of strengthening climate information. But these are all short-term. What is needed for Zambia and for Lusaka, I think, is this the need to move beyond the 5-year programmatic planning into the 20 years, 30 years, and 50 years. But we understand that the models that are available for climate projections are way up there, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So can we get these into local level models and into location-specific models? Two groups that are doing that, the Invest of Zambia, I think Mr. Siame is involved with them, but also the Department of Mathematics that are helping to downscale these models to local level work, as well as the SASCO that is also intending to do similar work to scale down and also create a platform for to generate scientific knowledge on climate change in Zambia. So those were the two main ones. I could go on to start talking about the social things that should happen and the change in perception, but I will end here for now.
Thank you. All right, I think you'll agree that the 4 speakers have given us an extraordinarily rich context of the challenge around cities. Cities seem to be magnets for people. Lusaka, I think, is growing at 5% per annum. And I found it extraordinarily interesting that it was originally planned as a garden city, this was by the British, for 13,000 people. And look at it today. But the problem is that this attraction for people is not being matched by an attraction both for investment and capacity. So the two challenges, climate change aside, is that we have extraordinary capacity deficits amongst the actors who make decisions in cities, and we have an extraordinarily large problem with capital investment. I think perhaps for me, a piece of analysis that is missing here is how this capital investment takes place. What are the drivers of capital investment, both at a national basis and downscaled into the city basis? And to what extent, specifically with regard to infrastructure, does the climate question come into how one molds and tailor makes that capital investment going forward into the future? That's a bit of a prompt to you, Sue, to make some reactions, and I'm sure that's going to come up because you and I spoke about that at lunchtime.
Yeah, so thanks. Hello, everybody out there. Just to sort of be very clear about what we are doing here collectively, so the panel, the audience, and everybody online, is we're stopping to pause to reflect on what we're doing in a process that we know is fragile. Okay, we know we're on dangerous terrain, and we know, as Seth has just said, that we are going to make interventions which we will be held accountable for. Okay, and we're going to do that, for those of you from Cape Town, if you imagine Pinelands, which was the Garden City, which has already grown to the current population of Lusaka, which is about 2-3 million, and it's going to at least double again. Okay, and it's going to do it over that 5 to 40 year period. And this is one of many places. And the difficulty for us, as we sit down here together coming from different vantage points, is that everything we bring to this terribly difficult intervention that we are making, not we're going to choose whether we make or not, we will make the intervention, is born out of fragility. Now, we know some things, okay? So from a climate science point of view, we know that the climate is changing. We know from the Fifth Assessment Report that cities are fundamental pathways of that change, but we don't know, which is what you are interested in, on what we need to know in any particular urban context in order to be able to make a meaningful intervention into that. So there's a fragility in the climate science. And what I'm suggesting is we want to be a little bit humble about that, okay? Because it's not like we know everything already. Similarly, we know that the system that we're about to intervene into is itself fragile. Okay? Cities are changing. They are growing very, very rapidly, and they're growing in ways that we don't fully understand. Okay? We also know that cities are increasingly exposed to risk of one or another kind in ways that make what are already unstable situations even more unstable. Di started us off by saying, and if that weren't bad enough, that we've got climate science and climate instability, we've got urban instability and not really terribly much conviction. The urban community is a very fractured one. I can spell that out in more detail. But so too are the governance regimes. We know, and we're only just beginning to get a handle on, the fact that governance in the 21st, urban governance in the 21st century in particular, is not as simple as it was in Britain or France in the 19th and 20th centuries, okay, where it was dominated by a municipality, and whatever you thought of that, you kind of knew that as long as you understand which was the right committee to act in, you would be able to know how to intervene, and that would give you your levers. It was like driving a relatively simple car with 3 gears, and you could choose which gear you could go in, and you would make your intervention. And that's not the case now. Okay, so what Di set us out to say, and I think her understanding of the complex urban governance configurations was a way to help us open up this question of how does this machine that we want to intervene in work. But Di, I've got a question that's for you, but perhaps a bit wider for the project as a whole. And I'm not sure we can answer it now, but can we at least reflect on it? I don't want to make things more complicated than they already are, partly because I think what Di set out for us was an extremely reasonable, systematic framework for mapping and making legible a series of complex processes. Okay, and if one follows that through, as she began to demonstrate, and as we can see when we all begin to start talking about one place, we can begin to debate whether this interpretation is correct or that, or whether we should nuance it in particular ways. There's more power here or less power there. In that way. But I do have a question for us, which is, and for the project as a whole, and that is whether or not the purpose of such frameworks is to identify the best opening for climate science in its current form. In other words, we're not changing climate science. We simply want to take the knowledge that we currently have and find the most responsive soft point. Yeah? Is that the purpose? Or is the purpose to use the knowledge that we have to find the place in the governance regime that will change the city? In other words, the most appropriate place, not for it to be absorbed, but for it to change. That's not the same question. I might listen, I might agree, but I don't have the power to change. So we have to ask a slightly different set of kinds of questions if that's where it is. And similarly, I would ask whether or not our intention is to say, this is how the urban system works, and because this is how it works, and this is where they can or cannot read entry points from outside, climate science has to change. Okay? In other words, what has to change? The city or the science? An important question, I think, for us to be thinking about. So once we understand how cities work, what does that mean in terms of our recommendations? And I thought, Dayu, perhaps just give us some reflections on that in particular kinds of ways. And I think that takes us, in some senses, to making sure, and Hannah, the link in a way for me between yours and Dai's point was to say, I kept thinking back to the original framing of what we're saying, which is that we've got this window of opportunity, or this window, it's not even of opportunity, it's kind of like you jump now or you don't jump at all, right? It's kind of scary, isn't it? But if we are convinced, as I think most of us are, that really what we do over the next period of time, the next 10 years probably being the most important, is our reading absolutely correct? And are we focusing on the right kinds of things? And I was worried in our discussion that we were focused, that we were too taken up with processes which appear to be in transition now. In other words, with real people who make real decisions, with decision-making processes which are visible, where people talk to each other and there are committee records, rather than looking at some of the locked-in decision-making structures. And in particular, I wanted to raise the question of the law. Because what law does is law is a record of what people historically decided. And one of the really nice things about it is that we make decisions about it, but once it's in the law, it applies over a period of time. So you see that in Southern politics at the moment. We locked in place a constitution 20 years ago, and for the first however many years, it was particularly, well, everyone said it was lovely, but nobody had tested it. Okay, now is the moment of testing, and that plays out over all sorts of things. So I wondered, where in the framing and how do we look at the institutions of things like law and budgets, and perhaps even the operation of the committee system, the administrative structures in particular kinds of ways. So perhaps just to get a reflection from there, and that then sort of took me, when Gilbert was talking, I was very struck, because what I really like is when you get down to the actual mapping and you get down to real institutions. What you were very polite about was that you told us that some institutions were more important than others, and that was very clear in your discussion and in the diagrams. But what you didn't speak to, and I'm not just asking for the political dirt here, what you didn't say, and I think it's a question for all of us, is does it matter if some institutions work better than others? Okay? In other words, we can map things and we can say, in theory, organization, the mayor's office is the most important thing. But actually, if the mayor's office is defunct and not working particularly well, but the treasury works exceptionally well, does that matter? And I suppose that's a question for you, well, for both of you, I think, as well. It's not just who runs the city, but does it matter if we have particularly capacious entry points, or by contrast, if there are particularly dysfunctional either because they're corrupt or they just are inept or they're not staffed, which is, in my experience in African cities, most often the case. Okay, if there simply isn't anybody in, there's nobody home, then what do we do? And what does that mean about identifying the appropriate entry point? In other words, if we find the right entry point for climate science, but it's not a functional entry point, what do? Do we build it up or do we find an alternative, given how quickly we have to actually begin to react? And does that matter? And I suppose there would be moral and ethical questions about distortions that we may be putting in place through our interventions. And I think that's one of the questions that donors have had to face for some time, because quite often what they've done is they've come along and they've said, well, this country can't run properly if we don't have an effective treasury. And so they simply put in place an effective treasury, but it is utterly disconnected from a whole lot of other kinds of support structures. So very, very complicated. And then sort of I had a whole lot of questions written down, and then I looked up at one of your slides, and it spoke to something I'm particularly interested in, and so I want to ask you to pick it up and talk to it. And it does go back to one of the points that Dia made, because remember Dia said we're making two assumptions in this project. We're making an assumption about an urban Anthropocene. Okay? In other words, that there is no longer a distinction between what people do and the natural system, that the human impact is so evident in the physical landscape that the natural and the social system have in fact become one. That was the one assumption. And the other assumption she made was that in fact that cities of the South probably need to be looked at in their own terms with some specificity and understanding of the detail. And one of your slides up at the top there had a thing about the three different elements of national government. And I thought it was really interesting because typically, and we heard all the speakers saying, let's talk about the multi-scalar complexity. Do you remember that? And what you were doing there was to saying, hang on, there's another kind of complexity here. There's what Parliament says. There is what the ministries say, the techie people, yeah, like Philip. And there's what the chiefs say. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about how do we make sure that we're getting to the real sources of power and influence? And does the message have to be the same message, or does it need to be crafted particularly differently for different kinds of constituencies? And so, colleagues, just in trying to draw this together, I started off by saying, look, we're sitting with an immense, it feels like we've got to jump across the chasm. We know that it's dangerous. We know that we're on shaky ground, and we know that it's shaky ground on the other side. We also know we're not quite as fit as we might be to make this jump. But the danger's behind us, and we have no choice. So we have to move ahead with confidence and humility and caution. And in doing so, it's important not just to understand the complexity. Okay? You can have a deep, nuanced understanding of whether or not you're sitting on sedimentary soil or not. And it would definitely be nice to know that if you were on sedimentary soil rather than on some good granite. Okay? However, you're going to have to make a jump. And so it's in that understanding that I think what I'm looking for is for us to remember what the politics is of the stuff that we're going to have to act on. And to be clear about that as we go forward. Now, clearly, we have to have our wits about us. We also actually have to be very clear about why it is that we have to do it. Because I think it's in that process that we are able to find the points of commonality, to actually listen to each other, and potentially to work together to jump across. Because I'm not convinced that on our own, any one of us gets us right across. So, thanks.
As always, so beautifully summed up. Look, Sue has raised a whole bunch of questions which in the time frame that is available to us we can't answer, but I think they're very, very good pointers for an ongoing discussion and for ongoing analysis. For myself, I'd like to perhaps just add that one more thing, and that is that unless we understand how the money works in cities, we can't understand them at all. And somehow I think that's missing in this analysis as well, is a really acute understanding of what makes cities tick financially. Where do the flows come in and where do the flows go out? And how do they change and grow? And what in the next 20 years is going to be key in terms of exactly that, those flows of finance. Because it's, after all, whatever changes we envisage, whatever climate proofing we might recommend to actors in the decision system that have been so beautifully described by Priscilla and Gilbert, if there's no money for it, it's not going to happen. And we're just going to have, as I say, the magnet of people gathering and agglomerating in these cities, and basically a vulnerability index that just continues to rise and rise and rise. That seems to be the pattern. And that's the thing we're trying to face up to, after all, is it not? We can leave these systems alone, but we feel and we understand that there's a rising vulnerability, and that is what a project like Fractal and the FCFA in general is in fact addressing. So now, in the spirit of some input from all of you and also from those who are listening electronically, and given that we've got, say, 20 minutes left, I invite the people who are typing in questions to close off in the next 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll receive those questions via the iPad, which will come forward. But I invite, say, 2 or 3, they may be questions, but remember, we're not going to have long answers, rather perhaps comments or thoughts or inputs from any of you in the audience, and you'd have to speak through the microphone so that our external audience can hear you. If there are any thoughts, inputs, or a direct question. Yes. And identify yourself, please. Chris, in your case.
Hi. Chris Jack from the Climate Systems Analysis Group, and very involved in Fractal, so very interested in how this all moves forward. I was very encouraged by Sue's response, because sitting through the other presentations, I was thinking exactly the same thing. We're on fragile ground. And I'm a climate scientist, so I'm used to fragile ground. And as I was trying to think of the analogies between climate science and social science or urban geography, and in climate science, we manage fragile ground 2 ways. We have lots of different models, so we try and look at things through different lenses or different models. And then we also try and validate. So we might take an event like this recent drought and say, okay, which of these models worked? I'm just wondering, to draw on the expertise around the room, is there an equivalent in social science? Can we try and mitigate this fragility in the same sort of way? Are there cases where that's been done in the past? Is this a good way forward? How do we mitigate the risk, basically?
Thank you, Chris. We'll gather a question or 3 towards the back there. Thank you.
Hi, my name's James Cullis. I had a question, and I suppose it goes to everybody, but maybe to Gilbert and Tipa and Lusaka particularly. There's a lot of talk about climate resilient infrastructure, and based on the work that Diane and both Hannah presented, it's relatively easy to see how those are controlled, and there's a long planning process, and they're relative actors, and a lot of that's often driven in the international or the national space, where they're fairly familiar with climate information, and you could see how that could be influenced, and maybe you could argue there's too much climate information over there and uncertainty. But what I saw missing was maybe the argument about climate resilient urban form, and the whole challenge around who, if anybody, has control about how these cities are developing as an urban form. And can you control those, and where does climate information play a role in informing that future development? I think, Gilbert, you mentioned something about the Minister of Finance promoting these economic nodes in parts of the city. You know, is that an entry point where climate information, and what type of climate information, can help guide that urban form, that rather than a big piece of infrastructure that takes 15, 20 years to build, and there's a lot of controls, it happens organically as people merge, and before you know it, you're in a situation where you have a very, very vulnerable situation, maybe like we have now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think one can almost add to that urban form the issue of the economic form. You know, why do people come to cities? Why is there sort of this a mismatch between what is extracted from the economy, and the people that rush into cities. And how does that work? So both the urban form and the economic form, I think, also play to each other. We see cities really expanding because of the economic form of developer interest in more formal cities, and so on. So those two forms, I think, are very critical and should be examined, as if the thing wasn't complicated enough. Do we have some external questions? Let's have a look at those. Sue, maybe you would want to grab a few of those.
He's doing that because he hasn't got his glasses on properly. It's a very small print.
It's age.
Response while I just read these.
Yeah. All right, well, let's do that, and then you can respond to those at the end. I'm going to give you each just a minute. Please, we have to watch the clock. It's 15 to go.
Okay, I'd like to respond to Sue's difficult question about is it the city or the climate science which has to change. And I think that we have to recognize that these projects in Fractal, they're short projects, they're 4-year projects. So the effect that they could have, in my mind, would be a very small contribution to this larger, difficult picture that's been painted. But nevertheless, built into Fractal, which hasn't been discussed here, is quite an innovative methodology of having city learning labs that have been called and embedded researchers. And this is a way of not only working with the city to see what they need, the actors to see what they need, and respond with the right kind of climate information that's necessary, but also that, and in the sense that will then stimulate some change and thinking in the city officials, build capacity, etc. And at the same time, the climate scientists, in responding to what this engagement with city actors, would also itself change. I see it as changing, although it has its boundaries and its assumptions and its protocols, the way it works. But I see this as quite an innovative way in a short-term project to try and get both to change. So bring about some seeds of change in the city, and at the same time, through this engagement, the climate science itself in some way would change. And that's how I see it. And so it is an innovative approach which we haven't discussed here.
Di, thank you. Hannah, hold the phone for a minute. Just out of respect for our external guests and given the shortage of time, there's some interesting questions apparently that have been raised, and maybe if you don't mind, I can ask Sue to respond to those first.
Well, first of all, just to say how incredibly nice it is to have people who are listening from Nigeria, somebody from Start who could be anywhere in the world. I don't know where you're sitting, Sine. Somebody in Australia, a couple of people in Zambia, as we would expect, both Copperbelt and from other places. So just an incredibly diverse group of people who've come in and asked questions. So, I'm not sure that we're going to have time to respond to them specifically, but they include things like from O.J. Vinton's in the Federal University of Nigeria, but how do we get parliaments to engage with climate issues as in the global south in ways that they do in some of the countries of the global north, like Canada and the US. A really pertinent question from Sene Habze-Tiong about decentralization, about whether decentralization is basically good or bad for resilience in the African context, because you've got so many resources concentrated in national governments. What does that mean? How is that? And given that that's the focus of where we're going, and with a lot of the new urban agenda is around decentralization, what's that going to mean? Dennis Mizwani asked, says, fantastic presentations, very clear, excellent quality, which is great to hear. Thank you that it's come through on the e-form. And he wants a little bit more information about what are the challenges or lack of action on climate change options, is the area of dialogue with stakeholders. Are there any intersectoral dialogue mechanisms where people from Lusaka Council, government and civil society can engage. So sort of perhaps a question from you. From Green Basin Naturals, Noah asks a series of questions. Noah, I've just taken one of them. One of the strengths of Zambia's climate change response agenda is embedded in the close relationship with overall economic development planning, coordination and financing. So we want to hold this up as a effective mechanism because it's got strong fiduciary architecture. So I think that's the point that Seth was talking to, the imperative follow the money and understand how the money around some of these things flows, and then you begin to get to this. Tafu from Curtin in Australia, so I hope you're still awake, says, how do you, a very specific question, but a fascinating one, how do you see the 9 parastatals who currently engaged in basic infrastructure services? Do you need 9 parastatals? What's the role of parastatals? Are parastatals in our imaginary? And those of us who are South African, of course, know that our parastatals are quite important, but they play out right across the African continent. And lastly, from Daniel, from Copperbelt, Daniel Apton, says climate change has had a discernible impact on urban infrastructure, particularly roads, bridges, drainage systems, important buildings and features of cultural heritage. What measures should governments put in place to mitigate against such adverse effects of climate change in the infrastructure space? So coming very specifically to that. And then Norman, you asked about the copies of the videos. Yes, there will be a video. So, and I think the slides will be part of that. So, yeah, I think lots of questions for people.
Thank you, Sue, and for, well, it's very nice to know that there's an audience out there. I mean, I think one doesn't know, but you are there, and I think those questions are so important. The important documents that have been written and published around this particular issue, the Lusaka case study and the Pegasus document, the framework report, and various other documents that I think are of interest will be posted online. So I invite everybody out there to read with us and to continue making comments and inputs. So this leaves those of you who spoke specifically to the issue after the important keynote from Dai to give us a take-home. You're not going to be able to answer all the questions, so don't try. Give us a take-home. Which challenge do you think is going to be critical for Fractal? Which is the one that sits up highest for you? Start with you, Hannah.
On the spot. Having been to Zambia a few times and having gone there and done research for numerous other projects other than Fractal, for me what's most alarming is the amount of activity and interest in Zambia at the moment, the amount of funding that they are receiving, and the challenge that they face as a country to try and organize that interest from donors, which can be quite persuasive and may not always be the decision that we would have wanted to have made 20 years in the future. So I applaud the activities of the Secretariat in trying to streamline that, and I look forward to seeing how they're going to manage it because it seems very difficult. And a minor part of that touches on what Sue mentioned with the capacity, where one of the key stakeholders is WARMA, the Water Resources Management Authority, and at the moment they're, when I last heard, had a staff of 6 to manage all the resources of the entire country. So that is the challenge, where we have huge money but low capacity.
Thanks for that point. I think it's such a critical point that there is, in a sense, an artificial economy and a real economy. And this is it repeats itself across Africa, where you see countries where the GDP is almost 70% based on donor funding. And that creates tipping points that are really alarming and vulnerabilities that are really alarming. And a sense that the natural economy is in a sense under-resourced and not understood clearly as much as it should. This focus on dealing with the donors and managing them and attracting them is perhaps an incorrect focus when you look, for example, that over $180 billion leaves Africa every year in extraction that is illicit. Come on, you know, that is, I think, something like 20 times the foreign donor amount. So we just sometimes don't look at the system properly in terms of the finances. A very nice point. Gilbert, your take home.
Thank you so much. I'll talk about 3 points. The first one is for Fractal and all the people interested in promoting resilience in Lusaka to understand is the role of politics and planning. And why I say that is what the local authority does and several other players in the sectors that we're talking about is basically influenced by the 5-year planning documents. And these are tied to political parties because every year we have politics. So we have elections, and then new government comes in, and they come up with a 5-year development plan. And the resources of the nation or government resources are tied to that. So whatever that is happening at local level in terms of energy, water is actually tied to that. And if we don't understand that, I think it will be difficult for us to actually influence what is happening, including the councils. It's about talking about the party that sent you to the chambers, and that is extremely important. The next one is understanding particularly for Lusaka, is understanding the role of the private sector, because there's huge money there, especially on business and smart facility economic zones, as well as housing development. And that is important to understand, because sometimes they can be too powerful to actually regulate by the council. And also they have sometimes special connections and links with the higher level politicians. And that becomes difficult to regulate. And others actually come through national governments, like through the Ministry of Commerce, and the council have very little to do but to approve, because they have already agreed and they have committed certain things in terms of job creation. Then the last component I would urge people take home is actually what has been echoed, is the role of donors and their interests, as well as how they fit within the national mandates or national activities, as well as what a resilience would entail. And I think that's important, particularly for water in Zambia. There are huge monies that are coming from the donors, and sometimes they may drive a different mandate from what could promote resilience. Thank you.
I think something really interesting that Gilbert has pointed to, and it's a common issue for all of us, is that throughout the 20th century we relied on the hand of economics to drive development. It's been extraordinarily successful. The world has become a healthier place. The species called Homo sapiens has flourished. Look at us. We multiply. But it's driven us into the Anthropocene. And on the other hand, we have set about certain democratic processes, and they're all very short-term. So we've relied on a very long-term investment cycle in the private sector and in the economy in general, and we've sort of popped on top of that a very fragile short-term democratic system. And one wonders, as you walk into the management of vulnerability in the Anthropocene, whether this kind of structure has got legs into the future. And this is a big subject, of course. It's a big question. It's a big ask of a place like Zambia and Lusaka, or South Africa, or Australia, or anywhere. But we have to start asking that. Exactly what type of structures look longer into the future and have that kind of perspective over and above short-term politics and the quiet subterranean long-term finance view of the private sector. Because they don't come out into the open, but they think 60, 70, 80 years into the future. But we never talk to them. And I think you're raising that. What's the articulation between us as practitioners and these various bodies? Tassila, your take home for Fractal.
I had a long list, but I will stick to 3 for Fractal. It's a 5-year program, and yet it's the one that is intended to help build bodies of research that will look into the future 30, 40 years from now. So I think it's a big challenge to have 5 years of the program and yet be able to unlock the challenges in the longer term planning. That's one of them. The other one is when it comes to Lusaka and all the building that has happened, how do we look into the historical context of Lusaka in terms of the floristics, the soils, the hydrology, and all of those physical things that would be important in terms of making the city resilient? The other one is how do we catalyze and support this process of modeling that we talked about for long-term generating some climate information through modeling to see how climate will be in 30, 40, or 50 years, and link it to some sort of impact assessment for infrastructure, health, dams, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And then taking that impact assessment to feed into the long-term planning. I'll end there.
Tassila, thanks very, very much. It's exactly 4 o'clock. I can't believe it. And I think I'll leave a final word to you, if I may. And you can close off this seminar with those final words. But before you make them, I think you'll all agree that the inputs from our 4 speakers have been extraordinary. The quality of thought and your good work in Lusaka itself is challenging. The quality of issues that we're dealing with are so huge and vast and complex. That's challenging. And Fractal is I think, just the beginning, as you said, Di, of a story, of an exchange, but a very important one. And I think that's what's perhaps most exciting about this, is that it is opening up a new frontier. The final words.
Transparently, extremely valuable dialogue, and what I think is really important as we move forward is to understand that just because you're dealing with something that is complex doesn't mean that we can't agree on the terms which make it as legible as possible. We can't know everything. Okay, so we do need to move forward. And so, Chris, I think your question is really the pertinent one there. It's how do we reconcile these competing intellectual rationalities, which are both in the academic sphere and in the sphere of practice. So how people who are in Treasury think is not the same as how people who are in the engineering department think. How people who are in politics think is a 5-year scheme, supposedly around questions of democracy, and that is fundamentally different from how the private sector thinks. And how academics think, it depends. If they're climate scientists, they probably come out of conventional science and fairly positivist understandings. Many of the social scientists come out of diverse constituencies, but I suspect most of us can find some common ground in fields like critical realism, which look for trying to understand what the drivers of change are. And if we could find a way of operating where we are able to understand the assumptions that we make, recognize where they're not the same as everybody else's, and make sure that at critical points that we're not acting ideologically only as we move forward. In other words, if we can triangulate, in other words, that the evidence that we're presenting to intervene in practice doesn't simply make sense from my perspective, I think that would give us some ground points to move forward, and that would be helpful. And if we can do that in ways that make sense in particular places for multiple constituencies, I think that we know we can operate on the 80-20 principle and move ahead. Thanks.